Are EU countries using the COVID-19 emergency to clamp down on refugees? Italy and Greece are accused of being more hostile to migrants during the pandemic. Is another humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean on the way? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome. I'm Imran Khan. Italy and Greece have long complained of being overwhelmed by undocumented migrants desperate to get into Europe. The EU members are the main landing points of refugees and asylum seekers crossing the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa and the Middle East. Rights groups say the coronavirus pandemic has given both countries a chance to crack down on the unwanted visitors. The president of the Italian island of Sicily has banned new arrivals and ordered all refugee centres to close by midnight on Monday. Nello Musumeci says it's needed to stop the spread of COVID-19. But government leaders in Rome dismissed the Sicilian order as invalid. Doctors in Italy say migrants are linked to only a small number of new coronavirus infections.
Ai primi di marzo.
In early March and again in April, we sounded the alarm over the influx of immigrants that we were registering. We knew it, the state services knew it. A few weeks later, the central government predicted about 10,000 migrants would be ready to leave for Sicily. Our view is that that was the opportune moment for the central government to open a serious dialogue with North African countries, in particular Tunisia. It is not a country at war, and it is not among the poorest countries in Africa.
The Greek government is rejecting accusations of secretly expelling migrants. Rights groups and the New York Times say the Greek Coast Guard forced nearly 1,100 asylum seekers back into Turkish waters on leaky life rafts over the past 5 months. Some Coast Guards are accused of disabling the engines of some of the boats, removing fuel and abandoning their passengers on uninhabited islands. Let's bring in our panel, all joining us from Greece. In Thessaloniki, Niamh Kidi-Tabal, researcher at the Irish Centre for Human Rights, who uncovered the Greek migrant expulsions. In the Greek capital, Athens, Ulrich Bruckner, Jean Monnet Professor at European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. And also in Thessaloniki, Rory O'Keefe. He runs the organisation Karaki, which analyses political and humanitarian policies for aid organisations. A welcome to you all. I'd like to begin in Thessaloniki with you, Niamh Kidi-Tabal. Is this a new European war against refugees, or is this all to do with the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, what we've seen since March is a new pattern of pushbacks, whereby asylum seekers arriving on the Greek islands in the territorial waters are being expelled at sea, placed in inflatable life rafts and left to drift. And this policy, which is in violation of international and European law, has become extraordinarily widespread. In this case, although it's happening against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic, the Greek government have not necessarily in any overt way used the coronavirus pandemic as a pretext, because they have not in fact admitted to these practices.
So let's go to you now, Rory O'Keefe. I mean, you're looking at political and humanitarian policies for aid organisations. This must be a real concern for them that laws are being broken.
Absolutely, it's a concern. The difficulty has been realistically that the Greek government, and to some extent the European Union has backed them on this, have, since they were the opposition party in Greece, effectively weaponized the issue of refugees in Greece. They presented refugees as a threat, and repeatedly they have attempted to raise issues to suggest that other states, such as Turkey, for example, are breaking international law as an excuse for Greece not having to fulfill their obligations under international law by allowing people to enter the country and to apply for asylum. Of course, what happens after that application is up to the Greek government and the wider EU. But at the moment, people simply being denied the opportunity to land is contrary to international law.
Ulrich Bruckner, is it as black and white as our guests are suggesting, that it is breaking international law, that it is, in effect, a war against refugees?
Well, it's certainly not meant to be a war against refugees, but the practical consequences appear like this. We are a European Union that is committed to principles and values, and the humanitarian self-definition of what the European Union stands for is constantly being violated at the borders. And a lot of member states treat Greece and Cyprus and Malta and Italy as if it's not the business of the European Union as a whole, but if it is the problem of the countries that protect the European Union borders. So if they do their job more or less quietly, everyone else doesn't listen to the need for an integrated asylum policy, and therefore they currently seem to make more noise to get their voices heard and to put more pressure on something like an integrated approach.
Neve, that's quite an alarming thought, isn't it? The fact that these European frontline states are left to fend for themselves, and as long as there's not too much noise, the EU is just ignoring it.
Yeah, so what we're seeing now, this escalation of border violence, is in many ways linked to the structure of the European Union's asylum policy, which, as has been said, places a disproportionate responsibility on states like Greece, which have the external border of the European Union. But rather than just focusing on the lack of policies, I'd also like to highlight the damage that the existing policies have done, and these are policies which are based primarily around externalization and deterrence.
Rory O'Keefe, when these people are forced back onto boats and they're floating around the Aegean Sea, sometimes without an engine, I mean, that must be harrowing for the people inside those boats. But it's a humanitarian problem that needs to be addressed, and it doesn't seem to be being addressed.
I mean, it's absolutely a humanitarian problem. We already know that people die regularly on the Mediterranean. In 2015, the death of one child for a short while helped to change European attitudes to the problem as a whole. But we know people die on the Mediterranean, and forcing people back in effectively floating tents, as you say, without engines, onto a relatively calm but still dangerous stretch of sea is literally risking those people's lives. In terms of I do think that sometimes there is a tendency to talk about the humanitarian as if it's different from the law. The law is very, very clear. Every single person who believes they have any reason to do so is entitled to travel to any state they want to reach, as long as they apply for asylum when they reach that state. That's what international law says. European law has added some extra bits and pieces to that, but that doesn't nullify the original sense. So yes, in a humanitarian sense, it causes people a great deal of distress. It literally risks their lives. It means that they don't know where to begin again when they arrive back in Turkey, which is, of course, what we're talking about from a Greek perspective. But fundamentally, there is not a difference between the humanitarian approach and what international law says about the rights of the refugee.
It's interesting that you do bring up the case of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old boy that you mentioned there who washed up on the coast of Turkey dead. Now, I want to bring you in, Neve, here. After that, there was this wave of sympathy for refugees. What happened to that? What happened to that wave of sympathy?
Well, in part, we've seen, in Greece at least, a constant move towards further securitization of policies relating to migration, and that has been particularly evident this year with the introduction of reform of the asylum legislation with the International Protection Act and recent amendment in May. The policies that we're seeing now are about stepping up returns and about reducing the procedural safeguards as well. So the right to seek asylum has been severely undermined and continues to be eroded.
Ulrich Bruckner, the refugees have long been used as a political tool, going back 2 or 3 decades now by various different governments. There was an agreement between the European Union and Turkey that Turkey would house Syrian refugees within its own border. President Erdogan, on a number of occasions, has said, well, I'm going to open those borders if you don't give me what I want, and put pressure on the EU. There is a real politic here, like Neve says, of securitization, but of politicization of the refugee crisis as well. I mean, they are a useful bargaining chip for governments, aren't they?
Yeah, and every government used it as a bargaining chip. On the one hand, because of the bad experience, when we look at the case of Italy, they tried literally everything you could possibly do. either with a Mare Nostrum approach several years ago with a left government to save every possible life they could save, and then they were left alone and no one in Europe took any one of the ones they rescued, to the exact opposite of criminalizing a humanitarian act. If a fisherman rescues someone, his boat would be confiscated, as the extreme other end of the political spectrum. And they learned that it doesn't help, no matter what they do, to mobilize enough European support for an integrated approach. But the integrated approach would need much more than border protection or a form of solidarity in burden sharing. It would imply also a form of integration of those who manage to come legally to the European Union, and also the foreign policy approach of addressing the problems in the countries of origin, like the root causes, which is much more a security and a foreign policy or a development policy necessity.
Rory O'Keefe, the mayor of Sicily has a point, though, doesn't he? That some of these migrants coming in, some of these refugees coming in, are actually coming in from quite safe countries like Tunisia, for example, and therefore they aren't covered by international law that applies to refugees and asylum seekers.
Okay, first of all, there is no such thing under international law as a safe country. You are entitled to apply for asylum in another state if you feel that you're being persecuted by your government. That is, there doesn't have to be a war. There doesn't have to be some kind of persecution of a social group. If you feel that there is a good case that you or a member of your family is being persecuted, you are entitled to apply for asylum. Now, of course, once we come to the point of the country who you're applying for asylum within their borders, of course, that country is allowed to make a decision as to whether or not the country is dangerous. But what the Italian government, and in this case, the mayor of Sicily, who is not the Italian government, but what the Italian government is not entitled to do is say, we regard Tunisia as safe, therefore nobody in Tunisia is allowed to enter and apply for asylum. Now, one of the reasons that this is, one of the reasons that this is a very serious situation is that we have repeatedly seen refugees come to the European Union from Pakistan, for example, which is not regarded as a dangerous state by many European states. People are then sent back to Pakistan and immediately disappear. As far as we know, those people have been, let's say, contacted by police. But there are risks to individuals that are not the same as risks in a state as a whole. And we do need to be as clear as we possibly can that the individual's right to claim refugee status is not the same as a declaration that a country as a whole is dangerous to everybody.
There is an interesting case in Pakistan. I know some of the cases that you are talking about, having covered Pakistan quite extensively over my career. But there is a case of refugees claiming to be refugees, but actually there are economic migrants coming from places like Pakistan. Niamh, I just want to say this is a problem within the country of origin where they should declare themselves to be economic migrants, or is this simply people so desperate that they're getting out any way that they can and they're paying smugglers? I mean, you know, where do you secure these borders?
Well, it's difficult to speak about this distinction when we're speaking about violations of human rights which apply to all people, regardless of their nationality or their migration status. European Union member states such as Greece have in place systems that are designed to, according to their own criteria, decide on the eligibility of asylum applicants for international protection. So that assessment is not something which takes place at the border or takes place in a matter of hours after people have arrived. That's a decision which has enormous consequences for the lives of individuals and needs to be given fair due process to be determined.
Fair and due process, Ulrich Bruckner. It seems to me that we are talking about some very interesting legal language that the EU needs to abide by and force its members to abide by as well. Is there a legal process here whereby you can put pressure on the EU and its member states to abide by the laws that are already there?
Well, the EU is a legal organization, and the reason why it functions so well for so long is the fact that everyone believes in the rule of law. That's sort of the basis of everything. But unfortunately, it's not just either a legal problem or a humanitarian. If it would be just a single-dimensional one, then we could easily find a solution. but it is also a question of what is the internal situation in each and every country? How much is a government under pressure by populist forces that instrumentalize refugees or the whole fear of what could come with migration? And now the combination of we don't know migrants, which in countries that have 99% of population being the same ethnicity or no one has ever lived next door to a foreigner, countries like Poland or the Czech Republic are far more homogeneous than Germany, for example, who took a large number. The discourses in these countries are fundamentally different, and nobody cares about what is the legal framework. If the government, according to the people, is not doing the right thing, the government will be kicked out of office in the next elections.
So there's a political problem then, and that's actually quite crucial. The way Australia dealt with their refugee problem is they set up in some cases offshore offshore bases where people could be processed. Is that one way to go, Ulrich, do you think?
Well, again, if we are committed to our humanitarian standards, it's certainly not a solution that has anything to do with a self-binding commitment. It's something to externalize the problem. And as we started with, fighting a war against refugees to please right-wing forces in the country, but certainly not taking care of people in need, which is the international commitment that all these countries have signed.
Niamh, you're an expert on human rights when it comes to the Greek migrant expulsions. What sort of human rights abuses did you see?
So these incidents entail a number of different violations of international and European law. To begin with, they risk violating the principle of non-refoulement, which is the cornerstone of refugee protection. They also, because they are expulsions which are happening to a group, they can also be defined as collective expulsions because the individuals who are arriving in Greece to claim asylum have not been given the opportunity to register their asylum claims or for any individualized assessment to be made about their own cases. But what's also important is that beyond just looking at these practices, whereby asylum seekers are abandoned at sea in inflatable life rafts as just a means of pushing back migrants in violation of international law, they also represent a form of torture or inhuman and degrading treatment because the people on board these life rafts suffer extremely while they're at sea. Before they're transferred to these life rafts, they have their personal belongings, including mobile phones and money, confiscated, and then they're simply left to drift at sea, oftentimes without any way to make a distress call, and they're just spinning around in circles, waiting to be rescued.
But then that is a legal issue, isn't it? The country is breaking the law, therefore pressure should be brought to bear on it. But Ulrich, you seem to be suggesting that the EU doesn't have any teeth here.
Well, the EU has only as much teeth as the member states shift legally on a European level. And we are talking about something that is essential for the self-definition of a sovereign state, to define what is us and what is them, because in a democracy that forms the demos. And if countries have problems or no experience with integrating large numbers of people that are considered to be different, then the whole discourse on what is diversity differs greatly when we look at the different member states. This is one of the big problems why the German EU presidency right now has such a hard time finding a common denominator for an urgently needed reform.
Rory O'Keefe, I mean, what we're hearing is very bleak. Is there anything practically, realistically and quickly that can be done to help these people now?
It's an extremely difficult question. If I may just go back to a previous point that's been talked about the EU a couple of times, one of the most depressing things actually to have happened from a legal or humanitarian perspective in the last 6 months was in February when Greece closed its land border with Turkey due to an ongoing argument between the two countries that neither side comes out particularly well from that argument. But when Greece did this, when Greece took this illegal act, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Council, stood up and described Greece as Europe's shield. And actually, I would say that, yes, there is an argument to say that the EU only has the teeth that its states allow it to have. But at the moment, systematically, the European Union is occasionally openly and certainly by omission backing the breaking of international law. Now, what I would say is that there are things that can be done. I genuinely believe that the majority of people in Europe, if they are allowed to think about this in slightly more personal ways, are able to see that there are people who need assistance, or at the very least that people's human rights should be safeguarded by states all over the world. I do feel that there is a situation in which the European Union needs to take some action, needs to be able to say to the states on its borders, okay, look, it is not reasonable and acceptable for you to either break or allow the breaking of international law. But simultaneously, yes, there needs to be an agreement right across the European Union. Every member state needs to be able to say to Greece, to Spain, to Malta, to Cyprus, to Italy, we are able to help you. The European Union is the richest political bloc ever to have existed. Realistically, in my view, and from a historical perspective, there has never once been a political bloc in a better situation to sensibly deal with the situation that we find at the moment.
But Rory, it's not as simple as just buying off all the frontline states and giving them money and saying you deal with it. They've tried that;
No.
It didn't work.
No, absolutely.
So
Absolutely, no, I agree with you entirely.
So what's a quick solution to this? There doesn't seem to be one, does there?
Well, I mean, in terms of a quick solution, if we're talking about a magic wand, no, there isn't a magic wand. But if we're talking about is the European Union capable of dealing with the number of people who are arriving at Europe's borders? Yes, absolutely it is.
Just quickly, Niamh, we are running out of time, but I do want to ask you, do you think the European Union has lost its moral high ground?
I think that there is a serious issue with the silence that we've seen in response to increasing reports of pushbacks. And there are practical steps which the European Union can take if it wants to demonstrate its commitment to international and European law. And we're still waiting for those steps to be taken.
Ulrich, it does seem to me that the European Union has a lot of work to do before it can put in a unified policy. But the refugee crisis, the summer's coming. Libya is going to be a jumping off point once again. You know, we're in the middle of summer rather, and Libya is a jumping off point. But, you know, this is going to get worse and worse and worse before it gets better, right?
Well, so far we have been lucky because the numbers stayed relatively low during the time of the pandemic because it was less attractive to come to Europe that was hit hard by the pandemic. But the moment conditions for migration get better, the pressure will increase, and that is far more a political one. But we also see a lot of improvements that, yes, the EU took millions of refugees since 2015. The border protection was improved. The negotiations with bordering countries in the Mediterranean has been improved. We start a campaign to discuss with countries of origin how to improve the situation on the ground. So it's not that nothing has happened, but it's still extremely sensitive because it can quickly be instrumentalized. And this is what governments in the European Union feel most.
Niamh, let me just come to you very quickly. I mean, in terms of like how this crisis is going to develop in the coming years is going to be difficult, but the resources needed to deal with it might not be there given the COVID crisis. So surely COVID-19 is an issue when it comes to dealing with this.
Well, as we've seen, the European Union has continued to provide Greece with financial and technical assistance. I can speak only about the immediate incidents that we're seeing right now, and these are surely not motivated by economic factors.
I want to thank all our guests, Niamh Keady-Tabal, Ulrich Bruckner and Rory O'Keefe. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.